So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here. We would like to welcome you to this workshop on supporting clinical trial data meta-analysis through trusted research environments, which have been organized as part of the EOSC-ENTRUST project. We are very happy to have here such a diverse but complementary group of experts, and this actually reflects the importance or relevance of the topic and the value of collaboration in addressing this issue of sharing and reuse of sensitive data, in this case, clinical research data or individual participant data. We would like to, in advance, thank our speakers for sharing their expertise and insights, which will set the stage actually for the panel discussions later on. And also we would like to thank our panelists and other participants who will hope that we provide us with some actionable ideas that we can take forward. One quick slide to give a very short set of the stage introduction on this. So clinical research data, we all know that is if we share it, it will accelerate scientific discovery and enhances the healthcare provision, which is very good and is one of our goals. And so it also provides access to individual participant data, enables performing new analyses by researchers with diverse expertise, and also it allows to pull data from for meta-analysis, which will increase indeed the statistical power of the research. But there are some key barriers to data sharing and reuse, especially ethical and legal challenges that have to do with privacy concerns and compliance with regulations. There are also organizational barriers, like, for example, lack of incentives, lack of infrastructure or clear policies. There is also barriers regarding semantic and technical issues, like, for example, data standardization and interoperability issues. But in the horizon, we also have some emerging opportunities, like, for example, the European Health Data Space, which is promoting the secondary use of health data, for example, routinely collected health data. Then we have also some national health data hubs, which are growing initiatives that facilitate access and reuse of health data. And we have then routinely collected health data, which is valuable for informing clinical research, for supporting patient recruitment, and for stratification, which improve the generalizability of clinical trial results. So the scope of our workshop. So very briefly, this workshop is being organized as part of one of our tasks in the EOSC-ENTRUST project, which will be introduced by Willem briefly later on. And our task is called Driver 3, which is basically a use case, which is for enabling secure transnational reuse of clinical research data in a legally and ethically compliant manner. And the idea of this driver is to identify, understand, and address the data sharing challenges which are faced by the clinical research community, to provide also the ENTRUST Trust Research Environment Network with a minimum requirement for clinical research data reuse. And the workshop itself will bring together experts from a number of key areas, including meta-analysis, statistics, data sharing, repositories, infrastructures, federated analysis, and legal and ethical framework. And the idea is to explore together opportunities and address challenges for improving meta-analysis of individual clinical trial data through federated trusted research environments. And then finally to identify and formalize key requirements for TREs to improve this analysis. So the expected outcome are one, to identify and formalize the essential requirements for TREs to enhance IPD meta-analysis capabilities. Second, to use these insights to contribute to the development of a European network of trusted research environments dedicated to managing sensitive data securely and efficiently. And finally, the outcomes will support the joint development of a common blueprint for federated data access and analysis, promoting then interoperability across Europe.
Good afternoon. My name is Willem Boiten. I'm a program manager working for Ligature and for half of my time for HealthRI. So Ligature is a program management organization running large collaborations in the biomedical sciences field. And I'm specialized in collaborations in the area of health data, and that's how I ended up in EOSC-ENTRUST. Within EOSC-ENTRUST, I'm co-leading the drivers work package, and that's why I was asked to present this. So I realized that quite a few of you actually are part of EOSC-ENTRUST, so most of this should be quite known to you, but yeah, we also thought it was good for the others to give a brief introduction of the project itself, and then I will dive into the drivers work package. So what are the objectives of the project? So it's a Horizon Europe project, and it's focused on trusted research environments, of course. And first of all, we want to create a collaborative network of those trusted research environments and really build a community. And within that community, we want to come up with a common language around architecture, standards, and things like that, so that that different theories can collaborate and can be used in consortium. On the other hand, we also want to disseminate our results and make sure that funders and governments are aware of theories and make use of theories when the use case arises. So we really want to reach out. And then finally, there are some very large initiatives, the European Open Science Cloud and the European Health Data Space. And we want to make sure that we are well aligned with that and make sure that our theories and our theory architecture is aligned with that. One of the key outputs of EOSC-ENTRUST is the EOSC-ENTRUST blueprint. And this blueprint provides, first of all, an architectural overview and contains the things you would expect from an architectural overview, as the specifications, the interfaces, the technology. But it also contains additional things like legal agreements or templates for legal agreements and operating procedures. And the blueprint is really informed from two sides. On the one hand side, from the drivers, which are the use cases, and which we are discussing today, and on the other hand, from the providers. So these are TRE solution providers. And just a quick slide on how they are on board in EOSC-ENTRUST. So we have what we call a provider forum, which is a group, quite a diverse group of TRE providers across Europe. So it's geographically dispersed, and also they are sampled from different backgrounds. So there are high capability, low capability theories, specialist theories. So quite a diversity of theories we have on board, and that help us to build our blueprint. So now getting to the drivers. So these drivers are real-world use cases that test our theory blueprint and also the other technology components in our blueprint. And it gives the perspective from representative theory users. And it is important also for the discussion today, I think, it's important to realize that we have two types of theory users. So on the one hand, it's what we commonly see as the users, so the data users, which are usually researchers or policymakers. But on the other hand, data providers are also an important user of theories. because they make their data available through a TRE and should be comfortable with the TRE doing so, and they will have specific requirements. So it's important to take both perspectives, both the perspective of the data user and the perspective of the data provider. And then, how do we take them on board? So we organize workshops where we gather requirements and also try to align those requirements as much as possible across the use cases, so that it's possible to generalize this in the blueprint. We have 4 of these drivers, and each of the driver addresses a specific real-life problem. So first of all, we have the federated human genomics driver, so that is based on GDI, the GDI project, and the EGA underlying technical solution. And here we really look into the specific issues of large-scale federated access. Then we have a social sciences use case where we look at transnational data sharing. So using TREs in different countries and use them in a concerted fashion. Then we have the use case that's actually the topic of today, so the clinical trials use case, and there we look at how TREs can help us to disclose clinical data, both clinical trial data and real-world data, in fact. And then finally, we have the public-private use case around health and environmental data, where we really look at the private side of TREs and how to involve those and which specific requirements that gives. So where did we start? So what we noticed is that TREs, the concept of a TRE has different understandings. So we all talk about TREs, but we often mean different things with it. So we really start to ask the really, really basic questions. So what is your problem and why do you think that the TRE is solving that problem? Who are your users? And then what is the expected user journey? So how is the user navigating through the TRE from the beginning, getting a TRE started, till the end, getting the results out of the TRE? And what does that mean in terms of capabilities and requirements? And in our terminology, capabilities are high-level areas where we have requirements, and then requirements are the more specific details belonging to that capability. Now, this is what came out of it, a more generalized user journey. And don't worry, I'm not going to discuss that in great detail here in view of time. But what you see is that the user journey is really going from the beginning, so that a user registers at the TRE and it ends with the publication of the results. And then it has all the steps in between. But what I want to point out here is that there are 3 key stakeholders, and each of them is lined out in this user journey. First of all, you have the user, him or herself. And then you have the data holder that's providing the data. That's the second stakeholder, as I already pointed out in 3 or 4 slides ago. And then in the middle, you have another stakeholder, and that's the TRE provider. And it's important to keep this in mind because these roles can be combined, and then it can become fuzzy in the discussion. But when defining requirements, we need to pull apart these roles and make sure that we put requirements on the right stakeholder. So what came out of the first set of workshops? There are some very high-level commonalities. So in terms of agreements, both from the data holder perspective, the data sharing agreement, and from the user perspective, the data use agreement. Of course, everybody has some functionality in place to encrypt data in transit. And of course, we have quite some usability requirements. So user want to have a user-friendly TRE. More interesting maybe is where the differences are. So sometimes you see that TREs are completely closed. There is no communication to the outside world. And in some of the other use cases, there is still internet connection and you can use tools or datasets from the outside world. So there is quite a difference. And similarly, at the end of the analysis, then the question is, so how can you get the results of your analysis out of the TRE, and what can go out, and who is determining that, and who is inspecting that. So also there you see quite some differences. So these are interesting topics for discussion. And then finally, my last slide, there were also some lessons learned in the initial analysis, and these are maybe also things to consider today in our discussion. So that's why I put them up here. So what you see is that each of these drivers have already experience with a TRE, and then it's really difficult to kind of go to the next abstract level and generalize your requirements, because you are really focused on the existing solution and may not think enough outside that box and look at more general at your requirements. So that's one thing to consider. And then you see that there's quite a different understanding of what a TRE actually is. So you may speak a different language between the drivers. Then I already hinted on that. So there's a conflation of roles. Some of the data providers also are data users, and some of the data providers are also TRE providers. But it's important in the requirements that we define, and in our blueprint architecture, that we really are quite sharp on which roles we are actually taking when defining requirements. And then finally, it's important not to forget the perspective of the data contributor. We tend to dive into the perspective of the data user, but the perspective of the data contributor is just as important in when defining requirements for TREs. And with that, I would like to conclude my introduction, and of course, I'm happy to address any questions if there are any.
Thanks very much. So my name is Matthias Briel. I'm a clinical epidemiologist and research group leader here at the University Hospital of Basel in Switzerland. And my research focus is mainly on methodological aspects of clinical trials and various types of systematic reviews in meta-analyses. So I was given the task to basically report from my point of view as a researcher doing individual participant data meta-analyses, what the requirements and challenges are. I also asked for this my colleague Ala Amstutz, and our expertise basically from which we are drawing in this talk is based on mainly 6 IPDMAs. So I've conducted my first IPDMA about 17 years ago, and as you can see, they IPDMAs then typically tend to get published in a higher ranked journal. The medical fields are, there is some variance, so intensive care, infectious diseases, oncology, and more recently then COVID-19. The number of trials per IPDMA also varied quite a bit. And here I summarized then the number of patients in these IPDMAs, and also here in brackets the ratio of the actually included number of patients in the IPDMA from the number of eligible patients overall on that topic. In the last column here, you see the duration that it actually took us from the first version of the protocol to the submission then of a manuscript. And naively, we had roughly planned about 12 months for each of these IPDMAs. And as you can see, they all turned out to take longer. So the longest one here was with 78 months, the meta-analysis that the first author of Holger Schünemann. So we've already published also most of the expertise or the experiences that we have made. We focused there on the obtaining and the managing of data sets, because we think that these are the most resource intensive and time consuming steps when conducting an IPDMA. And in retrospect, so the number of IPDMAs are increasing. However, what has been shown by different meta-research studies, the rates of data retrieval, however, have not really improved over time. So in the following slides, I will now summarize the requirements and challenges for the different tasks in an IPDMA. And I go through the process more or less chronologically. So the first step is identifying the eligible trials. This is nothing specific. That's just the usual sensitive search you do for a systematic review. Then when you have identified the trials, it's actually about requesting the individual participant data. And here we either contacted directly trial authors, or if we knew it already that the data would be in a repository, there were requests directly then made at a data repository. So the ratio here, I would say, over the last 17 years, it's the vast majority, so over 80%, it's direct contact with trial authors so far. Identifying these contacts and also then where the IPD actually are. So this can also be a bit of a journey, so that you realize only over time that a data set is actually part of a repository, for example. Typically, it needs repeated attempts via email, and I also typically then quickly use the phone to get in touch with principal investigators of primary trials. Then once we have established contact, we typically request the trial protocol, case report forms, and the trial reports, and of course then access to the IPD. So these would be the requirements. And this email correspondence, so that's often a challenge, can be often fragmented and delayed. So you write and get a response, but then you hear nothing for another 6 months, and you try to get back in touch again. So a personal contact, so someone you can really relate to is very helpful. So from the literature, we know that only about 60% of data sharing requests are successful. We typically offer right from the start with the invitation co-authorship in case the principal investigator of the primary trial can provide IPD of his or her trial. You've seen the durations I've listed in the table. So if it goes on for 3, 4, 5 years, it is a challenge that the data sharing policies of organizations and repositories can really change over time. And this has been several times the case. So getting now to the next step, obtaining individual participant data. So the first challenge here is that primary authors typically or often lack the time, the funding, organizational resources for data sharing or data curation on their side. Some have asked for financial support, so we have been confronted with requests of several hundreds to about 2,000 euros in addition to co-authorship. Then the step about negotiating data sharing agreements. So this step alone can take several months for an individual trial. It typically requires an approval from 2 legal departments, and it can go back and forth several times. Also, there are different rules and application forms out there for different data repositories. This is typically the case for industry-sponsored trials. Then primary authors, so we've made this experience, may agree to share IPD, but eventually they never actually share it. So you're really on a hopeful way, and then you never get the data. So this can also happen. And very interestingly, so the decision to share actually often hinges on the motivation of one single person. So even if someone is or an organization is very skeptical in general, but then there is one person who with whom you could establish some relationship, and this person really wants to push this project, then we were very often still successful in the end. And also an experience that we made is even a data sharing agreement in the publication may really not prevent denial of individual participant data. So there was an industry trial for which there was such a data sharing statement in the publication. But when I talked to a representative of this company, he just told me that they never share individual participant data, actually. From the literature, we know that small financial incentives, so in this case, around 100 Canadian dollars, did not really improve IPD retrieval. Another meta-research study showed that about 45% of IPDMAs obtained at least 80% of IPD. So not even half of the IPDMAs achieve more than 80% of or can include 80% of the eligible patients for a topic. And to actually receive then the IPD after signing a data sharing agreement, in our case, it took between days and more than a year. So the final step, so managing the IPD, so when you actually get the data, and so it is shared in all different kinds of formats and different degrees of anonymization, which is also not a big problem. It's just you need to be prepared and flexible here. An important step is also this standardization of variables and outcomes across trials in IPDMAs. And for this, you really need exact definitions from each trial. That's why annotated case report forms or code books are absolutely necessary. And one of the most, or probably the most important point once you have the data is that you also have a responsive contact person who actually knows the data, so statistician, data manager, or the principal investigator. And you need this for each trial, basically, to clarify inconsistencies. So in all IPDMAs I've done in the past, and for all included trials in these IPDMAs, we at least had one query that we needed to resolve. So it was really needed for all trials so far. An individual patient data is also needed for participants who were excluded post-randomization in individual trials. So this also happened a couple of times that the actual data set that we received first was basically not based on the intention to treat principle. But when we then requested also data from participants that were excluded post-randomization, we were still able to do an ITT analysis across all trials. Another challenge is if IPD for 2 or more trials are only accessible on one analysis platform or portals. So this is relevant especially for industry trials. So you cannot download IPD, so you have to upload the remaining data, then merge it with the accessible data on the portal, and then you can download again the results here. But if you have to do this for 2 or more trials, then a one-stage meta-analysis becomes basically impossible. Last point, reasons for missing data. So these can also be relevant when you want to make an informed decision about the most appropriate imputation method for missing data. And this is also not really the standard that it's provided together with an IPD data set. So I think trusted research environments can resolve or address most of these points that I have mentioned. But when I looked through these 3 previous slides, I think remaining challenges, even in trusted research environments, might be that primary authors often lack time, funding, and organizational resources for data sharing. That academic recognition or credit for primary authors in IPDMAs is an issue. So primary authors also want to participate and benefit often from projects where their trial data is involved. And this responsive contact person, so someone who really knows the data from an individual trial, was crucial in almost all of these IPDMAs, basically. Then the 2 last points I've just mentioned. So also to have then data for participants post-randomization excluded, and the reasons for missing data. So with this, I would like to end my short talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I'm Blaise Thomson. I've been asked to speak about pros and cons of federation. And my background is that I run a federated learning platform or federated analysis platform that tries to make it easy for the governance and the technical pieces and the risk perspectives to all be kind of simplified if you're doing federation. But I won't talk much about our platform. I think I'm going to try focus more just on the general pros and cons, which will hopefully be most helpful for this group. So I'm hoping that everyone knows what we're talking about with a federated analysis, but I just thought it helpful to make sure we're all on the same page. The core idea is basically that because it's so challenging to transfer data out of institutions into a centralized data store, we have this proposed solution where we send the analysis and potentially any AI models that need to run into the individual data owners' infrastructures. So those could be clinics or hospitals or TREs, and then potentially share back statistics of some kind. So that's the kind of broad concept of federated learning. Instead of moving data to a central location, you're kind of moving the algorithm or moving the computation to the edge. So at a very high level, just to kind of give you the whole summary of this talk, it sort of depends on what we're talking about. And so I think commercial contracting, so kind of agreeing a data sharing agreement legally, I think it's worth knowing that it's still required and it still can be quite painful, but it's generally quite a lot easier. On the regulatory side, I'd say it's mostly easier, although there are some caveats to that. The governance, I think, really depends on how you decide to do governance. So fundamentally, you can basically centralize the governance even though the data stays federated. And if you do that, it's kind of doesn't make a difference. But if the governance changes, it can become more complicated. On the technical front, there are various pros and cons. So that one's quite complicated to say whether it's better or worse. And sort of similarly on the risks, there are some risks lower and some other risks maybe higher. Okay, so this is basically if you like, the agenda for what I'm going to talk about. So before I jump into it, I think it's also worth knowing that actually quite a lot of the topics that kind of decide whether something is easier or worse with federation kind of come down to what the specific task is that's being federated. So because you're moving from a world where you're centralizing the data and then you're kind of leaving the analysis to later to a world where you federate the analysis, it means you have to be quite clear on what the analysis is that you're planning to do. And depending on the specific analysis, it can have different implications. I guess it's worth saying, because we're quite focused here on IPD meta-analyses, that's actually an example of one that I think is generally quite good for federation, mostly because you're not really sharing anything that's personally identifiable between the sites. Okay, so step by step. So commercial contracting. In our experience, the legal teams are very, very happy that data is not leaving the organization's control. But it doesn't stop you necessarily from having some kind of commercial agreement. Because there are quite a lot of other questions that aren't solved just by leaving the data remote. So you still need to decide who's going to own the results, what can be published, who has legal responsibility. For example, under GDPR, there's always a big question about who the controller of the data is. What can be done with the data? What are the indemnities? What are the liability limits? And how's governance going to work? So federation doesn't solve everything, but I think it really does make a huge difference to most sites. So broadly speaking, I'd say it's quite a big win on the contracting side. And I guess I'd also say often the contracting is one of the most painful pieces of any kind of collaborative data project. So that's quite a big one, to be honest. Okay, so what about regulatory? I think there are two quite important regulatory advantages with the federation. And a really big one is that the data can stay in the jurisdiction where it was collected. And this is becoming more and more of an issue if you want to do any kind of cross-sea collaboration. The EU, China, America, everyone is getting very, very concerned about their citizens' data leaving their jurisdiction. And there are some kind of workarounds, but generally they're very difficult. And in some cases, they're just impossible to get around. So it's actually the case, I would say, that in some cases, it's pretty much you have to do federation if you want to do a data sharing project of some kind across these borders. Another really big difference or advantage, if you like, of federation is that parts of GDPR become less applicable. So this is especially relevant if you're only sharing summary statistics. Again, assuming that you can be sure that the summary statistics are what would be called anonymized under GDPR, then many of the GDPR provisions don't apply anymore. So that's kind of really, really big wins. I'd say mostly it's positive. There are some use cases where I think the federation can cause a bit of extra regulatory burden. And it mostly comes down, in my experience, to clinical trials or collecting data for a medical device or things like that. Because there can be requirements to keep data. And if the data is federated, then it means you have to keep the data in multiple locations for many years, potentially. So that's a potential pain point, if you like. Okay, so what about governance? I kind of gave an insight to this in the introduction, but governance really is almost orthogonal, I would say, to whether the data stays federated. And in the projects we've been involved in, I sort of think that there's two main ways to do governance in this federated world. One is that people will set up essentially some kind of like central body that does the governance, and that in itself could have representatives from the contributing parties. So, you might have like a governing body from, let's say, you're federating between 3 institutions. Each one gets a vote, and they get to decide how which projects go ahead. Or you might add some members of the public, depending on the particular concerns. So that would be like a kind of a semi-federated governance model, if you like. But then you can also have a world where there's just some kind of central decision-making party that decides what's happening with the projects. So the governance actually has some important commercial implications, mostly to do with who the controller is under GDPR. So for those who are not so aware about GDPR, there's quite a lot of legal obligations on whoever is considered the controller of the data. And the definition in GDPR is that it's the group who determine the means and purposes of processing. And so depending on how this is structured, the different parties might become joint controllers, and they might be concerned about that. You can, like in the centralized model, it's normally kind of included in whoever has the data in the central store. They normally would decide what projects are going ahead. So that's kind of probably a bit clearer and easier to understand. Okay, so what about the risks? Well, the really nice thing in the federated model is that the data is under your control. So every institution, I've put this as kind of equivocal, if you like, but really, I guess I think this is probably a more important risk to most organizations. They're really worried about unauthorized data use and data leaks. And so if you can keep the data federated, that makes people tend to be much happier. One slight additional risk that you might have or need to consider in the federated world is that you're enabling third parties to run computational algorithms within the organization. And so it needs to be quite carefully managed to prevent hacking of the main network. So many IT teams start getting scared if they realize that outside parties are running code inside of the network. And that's why you have tools like the ones that we build to get everyone comfortable that everything is still secure despite the federation. Okay, and then on the technical front, this is maybe where there's the most most to say. So there are quite a lot of advantages of federation technically, and there are also quite a lot of disadvantages. So on the advantages, there's quite a nice property, which is you don't necessarily have to pseudonymize data because it's not leaving. So you might want to pseudonymize it anyway, just to mitigate risk. But in some federated projects, you actively don't want to pseudonymize data. There's a really nice advantage, which is that large data doesn't need to be moved or duplicated. And so as people start working with bigger and bigger data sets now, and there was a question about large language models as well, you're talking about huge data sets which become very difficult to move around. And so just leaving the data where it is actually technically quite advantageous. Setting up data pipelines to transfer data can be complicated if you're not doing a federated way. But then again, I guess setting up data pipelines in each institution is also complicated. But one nice thing about federated data is that it's kind of easier to keep everything up to date. On the centralized side, I think people, or reasons why people prefer centralized maybe, is data scientists often get a bit uncomfortable that they can't actually see the data. And so if you've got a data scientist who's sort of debugging, trying to work out what's going wrong, they always sort of feel a bit unhappy about the fact that they can't actually see the raw data. But there are some workarounds and things that platforms like ours can do. So, you could generate digital twins or generate example data or even share sample data, and that can solve a lot of those concerns. You can also, in the federated network, enable the generation of histograms or summary information. So that's one concern, if you like, or con of federation. The other con of the federation is you have to set up a federated infrastructure. So of course, every institution needs to have data pipelines and network access. And then the compute requirements are also duplicated. So every institution needs whatever hardware is required. So again, if we wanted to do large language models in a federated way, every institution needs to have compute capabilities to handle those large language models. So I guess I realize it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of advantages and disadvantages, pros and cons. Of course, many of the things are exactly why, or the cons, if you like, are why we built our platform. But I think it's important to realize that it doesn't solve every problem. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks for the invite. Folks, I am Rob Baxter. My job title is National Digital Infrastructure Technical Lead at the DARE UK programme here in the UK. For those of you who don't know what DARE UK is, we are funded through the UK Research and Innovation Research Councils to worry about federating trusted research environments for sensitive data, where sensitive data isn't just health data, but also includes government data, administrative data. So we are co-managed, if you like, by Health Data Research UK, where I sit, and hence my involvement in EOSC-ENTRUST, and Administrative Data Research UK, who are a programme which look at individual level data again of citizens in the UK, work, pensions, education, justice, that sort of thing. And really, the overarching challenge here is how do you link these data sets together in useful ways to enable the research that people want to do. So very briefly, DARE UK, we've been running since about July 2021. We've just entered our phase 2. We got £18 million from the government towards the end of last year. That takes us through to the end of our financial year, March 2027, to try and get something built. So our initial phases were looking at design, dialogue, consultation, understanding the problem, proposing solutions. Now we think we've got a good way of trying to do this, so let's do it. And our program is focused very much on those middle bits of the arrow there: data access and data environments, and trusted research environments are the essence there, if you like. We are really charged with making sure population scale research in the UK can happen with sensitive data. And so we start from where we are, which is not with a blank sheet of paper. We've had trusted research environments of various kinds in the UK for decades, in some case. The Office for National Statistics, the UK Data Service, have been around 20 years and more in terms of TRE provision. There are some very new ones coming on stream through the National Health Service in the UK, and there's all sorts of points in between. So we can't throw all this out, so we've got to start from where we are. There are large data providers, the small ones, there are capable trusted research environments, there are some less capable ones, as Jan Willem noted. There are other services that come into play, indexing, discovery. There are generalized platforms. All these things are part of the mix that we have to deal with. So whether we like it or not, we're talking federation. Wouldn't it be nice if all the data were just in one place and then we could analyze it? Yes, absolutely. Let's put it all in Snowflake. Yes, not going to happen. So we've got to start from where we are. We've got to join this landscape up. It's not a throwaway prototype, even though we perhaps like it to be. So we need to connect existing services in ways which are secure, obviously, standardized and non-proprietary. That's a big thing because there are different players in this ecosystem. As Blaise highlighted, Bitfound is one of those key players. We've got to make sure that everyone can still play in whatever model we come up with for federation. We can't just impose a technology stack on everybody. That never works. And we've got two use cases that we need to support here. What I call data pooling and remote execution. I'll come on to those in a little while. And it can't be a closed shop. It's got to be open to new participants. And before I go on, let me note that federation is not the same thing as federated analytics. These words are often used interchangeably and confusingly. Australia is a federation. Interstate trade between Queensland and New South Wales is an example of federated analytics, if you like. So that's my distinction. Trusted research environments, what are they? Let's start with that. Essentially, they're a way of giving a researcher access to sensitive data held by a data controller, usually through the offices of somebody I'll call an information governance person, who is responsible for preparing data sets which are approved, they're project specific, they're pseudonymized in some way, they're research ready, as we call them. And a TRE is the place you put that. It's your digital fume cupboard, it's your digital level 3 biosecure workbench, which is what that is. Data go in from information governance, researcher sticks their hands in the gloves, and there they go. So rather more boringly, let's draw it as a yellow box. So first and foremost, TREs need, and I use TRE here in a general term. There are all sorts of terms for this secure data environment. Secure processing environment is an aspect. National or safe havens in Scotland. The names are unfortunately rather convolved. I'm going to say TRE. And I think a TRE needs is somewhere for information governance to prepare those data sets. And then it needs to give them a way to provide those data sets for research. And those are usually done in different zones. I call one a secure data zone. I call the other a research analytics zone. Because data sets are typically project specific, they're not the full data set necessarily. And often there's an air gap of some kind within the system. There's a formal process of preparing and handing over a data set for research. Then a researcher gets access, they stick their hands in the rubber gloves and off they go. And if they want to take something out, then they pass it back through the air gap. They can't take it out themselves. That also has to route through information governance. So that's kind of how TREs have worked in the UK context, certainly for the last wee while. My notation here is important. If you see an arrow, that means data can flow in that direction. If you don't see an arrow, there is no data flow. That's why I draw the diagrams the way I draw them. So the challenge we have is when a researcher has approved access for two data sets, which happen to live in different TREs now, because data are increasingly being offered for use inside TREs, no more download to laptop. This is a good thing, but how do you make those TREs able to talk to each other? Well, the classic way of doing it, the usual way, is, and we've seen this already, information governance authorities for the two data sets agree, I'll move my data set to your TRE, and then you can provide that to the researcher. We may need to get a trusted third-party linkage service involved in that, because we may need a linkage spine to zip together health data and justice data, for instance, which come from different authorities. But that's okay. You know, there are people who can do this. And again, information governance can zip the combined data sets together, provide it to researcher sticks their hand in the gloves, and off we go. That's kind of the classic model. That's not going away. That still needs support. We've got to still be able to do this, no matter how fancy we might get. With remote execution, which is the move the compute to the data model, which is increasingly of interest. And as Blaise pointed out, this is complicated. You need extra machinery over there for the researcher to be able to send queries out of the way. You need extra machinery over in the other TRE to receive any incoming queries. And again, for safety reasons, let's put any query management off in a different zone. Let's isolate it from the secure data processing zone. You know, maybe it's project specific. That's fine. So let's keep this idea of isolation within a TRE in mind. And then you've got something, researcher can send a query out, they get a result back, and then you can play nice games in how you might present that response alongside the local data to the researcher. Maybe you can present it as a single database table. Fantastic. Then it looks to the researcher like they just have one database using one local, one remote, two remote, any number of remote data sets. Technologically, we know how to do this. There's a second version of remote execution where, and this touches again on something that it might have been Rebecca's question actually. So what if the analysis that the researcher wants to do is complex? Maybe it has to take account of the fact that the data sets aren't schema compatible on both sides. They are different shapes. And so you need to factor that into your analysis. So a single SQL query is not enough. You've got some complicated workflow that you can put together. And you can upload that to some website. It's GitHub, probably not directly. Workflow hub, probably not directly, but somewhere, a software service, another service comes into play. And again, the receiving TRE will need some machinery in place, maybe slightly different machinery, because it's going to have to pull that payload in. And maybe it's got to inspect it, to Frank's question, how that's done at the moment. There are different ways to do it, but it's got to be comfortable that that can run. And then you can enable a researcher to send a job request out, different kind of query that says, please run that payload you've just pulled in and send me the results. And the presentation of the results is again up to whatever the TRE chooses to do. That's a model which is just coming, there are proofs of concept of this, and there are different ways of doing it. There are different commercial ways of doing it. We haven't standardized this yet. This is something that we're keen to do within the DARE UK program. There's a third model of remote execution, which is similar in all respects, except a researcher never goes near a trusted research environment. Instead, they can interact with a job service. Same idea, they've written a workflow, uploaded it, then they request a TRE, please run my workflow, and it does so. This is, for those of you who know the Open Safely model in the UK, this is the Open Safely model. This is very much an eyes-off model. The researcher never sees the data inside a TRE. They have some different kind of interface. It means that information governance, in this case from the left-hand side, needs to reach across to that job submission service because disclosure controls of the responses have to be done at some point. And you need to do that there. If you're outside a TRE, somebody's still going to have to mark your homework before you're allowed to take it away, especially if your query is actually going to multiple TREs there. So we finish up. These were sort of the use cases that we had in the UK, and we finished up with the simplest possible picture we could of federation, which is this thing. And you've got two aspects you need to fix. All these yellow boxes, the services that you've identified, they've got to be able to trust each other because they're starting to exchange things which could be sensitive. And you still have to isolate things within projects because a project is the thing that's been approved. It's the researchers, the data sets, the purpose that has been signed off by the relevant data governance authorities. So we've imported a lot of thinking from data space work in the EU over the last decade or more, and said, okay, if you create a federation between all these services with a standard security server, standard interface, and a standardized number of APIs and a standard number of objects that you need to exchange, what's the simplest set of those you could make, then you created that foundation of trust. And then you can look at the idea of, everyone can trust each other. So we can start to say, well, in the 5 safes, a trusted research environment is a safe setting. So the researcher's safe setting is that red box there, but that's a safe setting as well. But so is that. You can use modern software-defined networking techniques to extend a safe setting over multiple different services there. Remember, the thing on the right is one piece of Amazon Cloud, and the thing on the left is another piece of Amazon Cloud. In what real sense are they different compute environments? They're both Amazon Cloud. But how can you make that transparent to the information governance authorities and make them comfortable that, yes, this is a single safe setting and we're happy with that? So the thinking that the point we've arrived at in DARE UK is to do federation, there's a small number of things. Maybe it's incomplete, sure, but a small number of things you need to do. TREs develop a certain structure internally to support the kinds of things they're going to be asked to do. Standard connectors at the edge. And I use the word security server because I'm a big fan of X-Road. But if you look at any data space architecture, it's an IDSA connector. It's an SMP agent from Simple. It's the Gaia-X data exchange. It's the standard 4-corner architecture. This is how everyone is thinking about how to do this. And the key question then becomes, what do you need to make that federation work? It's difficult to avoid the idea you need some central registries of a number of things. You need a public key infrastructure signing authority. I'm a TRE, you can send me your data. says who? You know, who signed you off as a TRE? You need someone to be able to authenticate TREs in that way. You need common connectors. Maybe you can synchronize them all, like a Windows update sort of thing, sure. And you need a layer of governance. This isn't the data governance that Blaise was talking about, which is hard enough. This is maybe easier, but you have technical standards here. You have rules of participation. Maybe everyone needs to be accredited. Who looks after all that? You need a technical governance authority to make this sort of thing work. And fingers crossed, we're going to move towards realizing some of this between some of the UK's major TREs in the coming year. And apologies if I've made us even later, but thank you for listening.